Um, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And again, thanks for your patience as we're a few minutes late today. We really appreciate you joining us for this second session of our 2021 Food Literacy for All series. My name is Andy Jones. I'm a faculty member in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. And this year's Food Literacy for All series, the fifth year of the series, is titled "The Politics on Our Plate." Our kickoff session, which was held in March, just last month, with Raj Patel and Ricardo Salvador, centered around envisioning a transformed food system. And if you haven't had a chance to see their fantastic talk, please do check it out. There's a recording of it on our YouTube page, and I believe Ayan is going to be sharing a link to that in the chat shortly. But this week we have an equally exciting session centered around organizing for food systems change. As many of you already know, Food Literacy for All is a community academic partnership, and I'm joined in leadership this year by Lily Fink Shapiro, who's the manager for the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, as well as Devita Davison from Food Lab Detroit. And Devita will be moderating today's session, and we'll also hear from Lily in just a moment to introduce our speakers today. So we know some folks are missing the energy from previous years in-person weekly Food Literacy for All sessions, but we're thankful to be here together nonetheless, even in this virtual format, with the added bonus that folks from around the world can join us. So just a couple of quick ground rules today. We welcome your questions at any point. Please type them into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll save some time at the end of the hour to get to them. You can discuss with each other on Twitter using the hashtag Food Literacy for All. And finally, we want to gratefully acknowledge the support for the series this year from the Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund of the Center for the Education of Women. So with that, I'll pass it along to Lily for some introductions of our speakers today. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andy. Hey everyone, I'm Lily Fink Shapiro, and it is my honor to introduce and try to pull the common threads between the work of our two wildly inspiring guest speakers for today, Mónica Ramírez and Navina Khanna. So a few commonalities. Both Mónica and Navina are organizing to build collective power to make transformative change. Both understand that the people who are most negatively impacted by our food system are also at the forefront of the solutions. Both Navina and Mónica are organizers who are committed to identifying links that connect across various struggles for race, equity, and social justice. They make connections between the racial justice movement and the food movement, between the Me Too movement and issues of gender equity and farm worker justice, between Asians for Black Lives and voter suppression, migrant rights, labor organizing, and political power. Navina and Mónica both support worker-led movements. They have both received incredible national recognition for their work. Navina received a James Beard Leadership Award, and just about a month ago, Mónica was recognized by Time magazine as one of the 100 people who are shaping the future. So our team invited both Mónica Ramírez and Navina Khanna to join us because we think they each think so deeply and strategically about how to create radical transformation in our food system. And I listened to an interview that described Navina as, quote, having her fingers on the pulse of the societal forces needed to transform food and agriculture. And I just read an article about Mónica that began with this: not many people can say that they've ignited a national women's movement, spoken at the United Nations, and walked the red carpet at the Golden Globes. So the last time I saw Mónica, of course, was in person. This was in Michigan. And I'll just say that she had an auditorium of about 300 of us at Food Literacy for All, standing up out of our seats, fists in the air, everybody chanting, "Si se puede." So I'm not sure what the Zoom version of that is going to be, but I can't wait to learn. I can't wait to find out what it's going to be today. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now I will turn the program over to my co-conspirator, Devita Davison, to kick off today's discussion. Thanks.
Oh, wow. I am so, I'm so humbled, so honored. And can I say that I'm a little stangirling right now two people who I admire so much. My dear friend, colleague and comrade, Navina Khanna, who I have worked with in the past. Thank you so much for joining us. Monica, we have talked. I have been an admirer of your work from afar. So this is just a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with both you amazing women. And I just want to say this. Listen, I feel like I know both of you, so let's just have a conversation, ladies. Like I don't want it to be scripted. I don't want it to be presentation. I'm just going to facilitate what I hope is just going to be what I know is going to be a fruitful conversation. Let me start off by saying this, because the topic of discussion this afternoon is organizing. And to me, organizing as the executive director of Food Lab Detroit, which is a community of bakers and restaurateurs and chefs who are working together, who I organized to work together to transform the restaurant industry and the food system here in Detroit. To me, organizing is institution building. It's also direct action. It's togetherness, bonding, but it's also storytelling. These are all strategies that we deploy. And a form of storytelling to me can be a simple story or acknowledgement. So before we begin, would it be okay if I just do a simple land acknowledgement? And I just want to acknowledge and recognize the Anishinaabe people whose traditional land I stand upon today here in Detroit, Michigan. I want to pay my respects to the Anishinaabe people and to their elders, past and present, who have been living and working in this land or on this land from time immemorial. Michigan is a great place of ancestral significance. And we have the opportunity here in Michigan to acknowledge past events, but more importantly, to use those events to help us grow understanding, to energize us, and to empower us in the next generation. And so I'm going to turn it over to both Navina and Monica. And I'm just going to ask them to kick it off by describing to me what organizing means to you. Navina, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can start. And I'll say, first of all, that I'm just really grateful to be here with both of you as well, two women that I am super inspired by. So yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation together and learning more about how both of you organize too. I think about organizing as bringing people together around a common issue, around common struggle, and building our power together to make change. To make change that will directly impact our lives. And we can talk a lot more about what that looks like in the context of HEAL and in the context of food systems. But I think the fundamental thing we can say is that every one of us is impacted by our destructive food system right now, right? Whether we're talking about the fact that there are 21 million people who work in our food system, who get some of the worst paying jobs and most hazardous jobs, or we're talking about the fact that all of us are facing the threats and the urgency of climate change right now. We talk about food insecurity. We can talk about so many different kinds of issues there. But we have an opportunity right now to be in common struggle together and to take that on together and organize and build power. So that's why, yeah, that's why we're organizing for change.
Thanks, Navina. Monica?
Hi, Devita. Hi, Navina. Thank you all for this gracious invitation. I mean, I have this amazing job because I get to be in community with heroes all the time. So it is a real privilege to be here with you, and I honor you and your work. You know, for me, I think that organizing is sometimes viewed by people as something that is only for certain people to do. And I believe that we are all natural organizers. We all bring people together, whether that's our family and friends or that's our neighbors. And I think that in some ways we have to demystify what it means to organize and who are considered organizers in our country. And, you know, the other is that sometimes I think that we're made to feel like there's so much distance between us, and whether that is on issues or geographically or values. And I actually believe that we are a lot closer than we think we are. And I think that one of the biggest jobs of an organizer, someone who thinks about organizing as a full-time endeavor, is we have this incredible job of figuring out how to help us all see a little bit more clearly how close we really are and how we can use that common struggle and the common vision for the world that we're trying to build as the motivation for us to actually meet and start doing the work. And so, I think that as of late, given all of the issues that we are contending with, sometimes it feels really difficult to be the organizers of your family or of your community or of your workplace. But I think that we're probably better positioned than ever before to do the kind of transformational organizing that needs to happen, because not only do we have so many more tools and resources, but there are so many people among us who are just actively looking for ways to come together to make change. So, my answer is not a textbook answer, but it is the fundamental belief that every single one of us has the power to bring people together and make great change.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to that, which you just said, Monica, which is so important. In the word that I just wrote down and underlined, you said we are positioned better than ever before with tools and resources. We're going to get back to that. But something that I want to talk about specifically within the context of both of your work and your organizations. And Monica, I was watching last night a conversation that you had on Facebook. And you said, Monica, something about organizing is not textbook. Get that, understand it. But I am reading Stacey Abrams' book, Our Time Is Now. I just consider her just an amazing organizer too, yeah, who I admire so much. And one of the things that Stacey Abrams talks about in terms of a strategy for organizing is surrounding yourself with smart people. Leaders have to look for the other high performers and start working, what she talks about, across silos, across missions. And within the context of the work that both of you all do in your respected organization, the conversation that I was watching on Facebook, Monica, last night was something that you have that's called the Rural Women's Collective Fellowship Roundtable. I was watching that conversation. And then Navina, you have at HEAL the School of Political Leadership cohort and teams. Tell me the importance of strategically, intentionally surrounding not only yourselves, but other leaders with other leaders across silos. Monica, can you talk a little bit about, I loved and I was fascinated by that conversation with rural women. Sometimes we think we know about the rural population, but we don't know about them. And I learned so much through that conversation. So can you talk a little bit about the Fellowship Roundtable of Rural Women and why it's important to organize rural women in the South? Well, this was in the South, but rural women, period.
Yeah, so thanks for watching, and I'm so glad that you got to check it out. So the Rural Women's Collective is a fellowship that we created through Justice for Migrant Women because I come from rural America. I'm in rural Ohio, the land of the Peoria people. Thank you, Devita, for that, encouraging us to do our land acknowledgement. And, when I moved back to Ohio after living in DC for a number of years, I felt like there was a real disconnect in so many ways from what people were feeling and concerned about on the ground and what was being discussed within the Beltway. And part of that was around who is rural America. And in rural America, I think that despite the fact that there have been people of color and women of color that have been leading for generations, there is this false notion that rural America is white and male. And so we created the Rural Women's Collective because we wanted to bring together rural women of color from around the country, and specifically to train them to be able to write op-eds, to do different kind of media because we need to hear from more rural women of color so that we can start changing it. We need to do the narrative shift work and the culture shift work around rural women and women of color in rural America. And so that is what the fellowship is focused on, is making sure that rural women have the tools that they need to be able to write and lift up their experiences and priorities. And they're women of all backgrounds. And so that's been really important, because I think that until people can fully see who is rural America and understand that the economy of our country and the economies in these rural communities are actually built on the backs of rural people of color and women specifically, then we are not actually going to be able to get to justice or liberation for rural people of color.
I absolutely agree. And can I tell you, not only did I enjoy the roundtable discussion, but I was super excited because I'm a huge fan of Highlander Research Center. And so to have their executive director in conversation, it was a fabulous conversation. So thank you so much. Yeah, Navina, I'm a huge fan of the political leadership cohort y'all do at Hill. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Monica, I'm also really, I want to connect with you more after the Zoom call about the fellowship that you all are doing and see how we can link our folks up with each other too. So thank you, Devita, for organizing us together into this conversation so that we can do that.
Absolutely. That was my plan, right?
Nice. You're like, these women need to talk to each other. Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to your land acknowledgement, right? Like, we know that this country was founded on land theft, on genocide, on the kidnapping and enslavement of people, and that the systems that we're in today are all just extensions of that founding, right? And we know that the way that the system structures, policies continue to be designed, continue to be designed for those that it's working for, and that mostly still is white men, and it enables white supremacy overall. And that until our folks are the ones who are able to actually make decisions about and to have agency and say over what's happening in their lives, nothing's really going to change, right? So I'm hearing, what you're saying, Monica, about folks just having the basic skills and tools that they need in order to make their voices heard, right? Like folks have been saying what they need, they're just not being heard, right? So with our School of Political Leadership, what we do is we seek out people who have already been in their own communities doing the work that's needed in their own communities, right? Whether that's creating gardens or organizing with workers or trying to show up to city council and make some different kinds of change in their communities. But we know that folks can't do that work alone in their own community or nationally, right? So what we do is we bring together teams of people across geography, across race, across sector, to come together and really build the skills that they need to be able to tell their own story, to run successful campaigns, to understand the map of power, and to be able to feel like they have both the team with them that's going to be organizing with them in their own communities, but also that they're connected to a network of folks that they're going to be in relationship with forever, probably, to be able to make the kinds of change that we seek. We hope that someday some of those folks will actually run for office or take particular positions themselves. But either way, we know that that folks are going to be in a relationship, right? Devita, you and I have known each other for probably 15 years now or something like that. We're in movement and life and relationship together, and that's how it is, right? And the more and more that we are connected to each other, scientists say that the best way to heal an ecosystem is by connecting more and more of it to itself, right? So part of this is about building that fabric and building that ecosystem and building that powerful movement that's full of leaders who can organize, can build, can find their power and see themselves reflected in each other.
Yeah. I want to I want to pause for a second. There's so many different things that I want to ask you all about in so many different directions, where I want to go. But this is something that I wrote down. I'm hearing from both of you. Monica, you talked about storytelling. You talked about narrative and culture shift. Navina, you just talked about how important it is for the individuals and teams and cohorts that are a part of your leadership cohort or your political leadership cohort to tell their own story, understanding how you map change. I'm currently in a workshop with another dope, amazing woman who I love. Her name is Chanel Matthews, and Chanel is the director for the Movement for Black Lives. And we are talking about this exact thing right now. How do you use culture? How do you use our current moment of what I'm going to call racial reckoning to actually mobilize change? We're seeing mass politicization. And so my question is, and it's a question that Chanel posed us, under what conditions do narratives shift? How can we connect the organizing that's happening right now in our communities as a result specifically of state-sanctioned violence and police killing and other organizings that are happening around labor, even in the fields, or labor that's organizing right now, even in the restaurant industry, Fight for 15, hello. So how can we connect the organizing that's happening, as well as use the innovation, the future thinking in Black communities with the energy that's being generated, and I say this mass action around, again, policing and the killing of Black men and women? How can we lean into that to actually shift our narrative? Under what conditions do narratives shift power? How important is storytelling and shifting culture within the context of that we're living in today? Either one of you all can jump in on that one.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, we understand as people of color in this country that we come from traditions of storytelling. In my community, stories have been the way that we preserve our history. They have been the way that we pass on knowledge about our families and about our culture. That is just part of the way of our lives. And so that's very natural and has always happened. The other truth is that we understand that if we do not take the leadership and begin to tell our stories on bigger platforms where they can be seen and heard, we're at real risk. Like, I truly believe that our lives depend on our ability to tell our stories and have them be heard. Myself and a few other activists and organizers organized a letter that you might be familiar with called the Querida Familia letter, which was published a couple of years ago in the wake of the El Paso massacre. And that letter was a love letter to our community, to the Latinx community, because we understood and we understand still today that the stories that have been told historically about our community have been false and have driven people to commit crimes and violence and hate against us. And in the case of farm workers across our country, it has been the use of invisibilizing our community and keeping people from hearing our stories that has allowed farm workers across this country to historically be exploited. And so I think for us, storytelling is at the center and has to be at the center. And as organizers, I think we have to do the work of making space to ensure that people closest to the ground from our communities have the space to tell their stories and to be heard, and use as many different kinds of mediums and as many platforms as possible to ensure that that happens.
So I don't need to repeat anything that Monica just said, which is like brilliant and all of it. And just to say that, the way that communities have connected throughout history is through story, right? That's how our families connect with each other. That's how our traditions get passed on. That's so much of what has always happened throughout time. And when we look at the urgency of the situation that we're in right now, where our communities are literally dying by the hands of pandemic or police brutality or climate chaos or, you know, whatever the case is. We know that we're going to just keep repeating ourselves if it's the same people that keep making decisions about what's going to happen, right? Like the people who created the problem are not going to be the ones who solve it. And there is so much genius and brilliance and wisdom and expertise and solutions that people are creating in their own communities already, right? Whether that's worker communities coming together and forming collectives that are just like childcare collectives or food cooperatives or making meals together, like whatever that is, like folks are creating solutions and have been. That's how we've survived this many hundreds of years. So much of our storytelling is about making sure that that is what is uplifted, right? So whether people are doing that through literally coming together over dinner, or folks are doing that through TikTok or Twitter, or the brilliant ways that the movement for Black Lives has told a story of police brutality that has been happening, right? It's not a new thing that this has happened over the last few years. Like the every 28 hours has been the case. What they've done is made it visible to everyone and told compelling stories that make it possible for us to not only see the problem, but also imagine something that is possible beyond everything that our communities have been experiencing for so long, and for communities to come together to envision and create that. So it's why we use social media, right? It's because of storytelling. It's like, it's at the heart of everything. And I just like, I think I'd actually love to hear from you a little bit, Monica, about this. Like when would we have had someone who is organizing everywhere from the fields to creating these fellowships to also be walking the red carpet, right? Like, and that is part of narrative change, right? Like getting this like celebritydom, even though I'm going to make the assumption that you're not trying to be there just as yourself, right? But that's part of us telling the story, right? And I'd love to actually hear from you a little bit, if that's okay, Devita, just about like that narrative shift piece too, right? How we change the story.
Yeah, Monica, I would love to hear that as well.
So I think, you know, going back to the big question, like how do we create the narrative shift? How do we create the narrative moment that allows us to see change? Like, I think that goes to what we have to have is the democratization of unbiased access and unbiased media. And that is what social media is helping us do, because as Navina said, as you said, we've always been telling our stories, and stories have always been told about us, but not in an unbiased manner, which is why people have been able to arrive at certain assumptions about who we are. And that is how the stories of police brutality and the many murders that have been caused at the hands of police across our country, and the injustices by systems, those things have been pushed down because the media has not been unbiased. So I feel like there's a conversation around the democratization of access to unbiased media that really helps answer this question of how we create the right conditions to create narrative shift. But you know, to the question around walking the red carpet, I think a lot of people didn't realize maybe that, you know, when we took to the red carpet after the Me Too breakthrough and as Time's Up was being launched, that was an organized action. Like none of us walked the red carpet because we were there to go to the Golden Globes. We organized an action in probably one of the most visible places in the world, right? Where literally some of the most well-known actresses were constantly, continuously over the course of an evening, passing the mic to movement leaders to talk about the communities that we represent and serve. And it wasn't about the event or the evening, it was about the action of making sure and visibly showing how you make space for other people and how you can link arms across sectors, industries, economic strata, et cetera. And that action of walking together and literally passing the mic over and over again that created a dynamic that I think then led to the possibility for further change.
Yeah.
And I think as organizers, our job is to continue to allow ourselves to have the clarity to see the possibility for creating those openings so that we can continue to push forward to win justice for the people who we represent and serve.
Oh, Monica, you took me right where I wanted to go. I love that. So many folks think that these things happen by happenstance. They don't. Like, people are actually behind the scenes planning and being very intentional about that. So the fact that you mentioned and lift that up, that was an organized action, a direct action, is beautiful. And so there are two things that are happening today. And I'm wondering if Mónica and Navina, you all can connect the dots of, and if you're paying attention to this, I know that I am, and I'm sure that you both are too, paying attention to what's happening in terms of the conditions that are happening right now in real world today, headline news. How can we lean into these conditions to also help people to understand the connective tissue between these issues that are happening right now and our issues around either lifting up migrant workers in the field, again, or transforming our food system. And the first one I want to call your attention to, and it is because my father is a native son of Bessemer, Alabama. He was born and raised in Bessemer, and him and my mother in the early 60s migrated from rural Alabama, to Detroit. And that is what is happening, headline news, the vote in Bessemer, Alabama, specifically as it relates to the vote to unionize at an Amazon warehouse, right? And I have to tell you that I'm looking at this and holding two things in my heart. Number one is even though my daddy is a native Bessemer son, I am a native Detroiter. And what that means to me is that my entire world has been shaped by union organizing. The union built the middle class in the city of Detroit. And so we are pro-union household. And so when I talk about direct action and leaning in, I can't help but to think about what sort of maybe transformational event or outside force it would have taken so that Amazon, the workers who were trying to organize in Bessemer, got the same impact and effect like the workers who sat down in Flint, Michigan, what we call the sit-down strike in 1936, 1937, because they leaned into something that was very important. And that is General Motors was trying to get the contract to create tanks in warfare because we were entering into World War II. And the workers said, if you all think that we are going to work for General Motors to help create tanks without recognizing the UAW and us being unionized, you got another thing coming. And they sat down and refused to work. They went on strike. And I'm just wondering, when we are now seeing what I'm hoping we're seeing a mass movement toward labor and union organizing, is this a moment for us to tie in the work of unions to the work that we need to do in terms of organizing food workers?
Jim, I can start. And I think this is a huge question. And I want to just acknowledge also that many Amazon workers are food workers. So those things are not actually separate. I think it's really important for us to just like name a couple of key points around this. One of them is that Amazon is an absolute behemoth, right? And Amazon, Uber, Lyft, a bunch of these companies right now are doing everything that they can to erode the labor protections that folks have fought for and won through history. And the labor protections that we have, particularly for food workers, farm workers, domestic workers, and others, have never been enough, right? Folks have been excluded from basic protections. Folks have been excluded from the right to organize, from the right to unionize. And it is going to take a lot. We know that in this fight, Amazon was union busting before there was even a vote, right? They were there's been plenty of articles and podcasts and things like that that have been done on that. So I won't spend our time talking about the actual tactics that Amazon used, but they were using egregious tactics to make sure that this couldn't happen because they're terrified of people being organized, right? They can no longer control things if we are organized. And I think it's important, just like a couple other pieces, and then I really want to hear from Monica too. But one is that one of the things that has happened through this process is that we have heard the stories of Amazon workers, right? We've heard the conditions that they're under, and that again is that power of storytelling, people hearing from each other what's actually going on. And then I think we also need to just look back to history a little bit and look at whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it is the United Farm Workers and how they organized together, or even if we're looking at the movement for Black Lives and others. Something that is really important is knowing that the frontline communities, whoever is most directly impacted, of course, has to lead with what the solutions are. But none of us can make the scale of change that we need alone, right? We need our allies with us. So what we also need is for folks to use whatever privileges they have, resources they have, relationships they have in order to also activate change, right? Whether that's the actresses passing their mic over to other folks, that's one way that you use your privilege. It also happened on the freedom rides, right? For example, white folks sitting with Black folks on the buses, and suddenly their white parents were scared that their white kids, were going to get killed in the process. And so that started rippling change too. When we started Asians for Black Lives, it was knowing that we would either get used as part of the model minority and part of a divide and conquer tactic, or we say, no, as Asian people, we are completely in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives, and we're doing this together. And so the rest of us can't just sit around waiting for Amazon workers to figure out how to make this happen when they are under those conditions, right? And we have to all figure out ways to organize together because we're all screwed in this process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Navina said. And I also think, part of the question that you asked is, how do we get comfortable with the idea of organizing and having labor organizing sort of at the fore, and kind of a resurgence of labor organizing in our country, and what is that relationship to the justice movement? And I think that in order for us to answer that question, we have to be really honest about the fact that many of us derive a lot of benefits from the mistreatment and ill treatment of certain workers in our country.
That's right.
And we have to own that. That might make us feel uncomfortable, but it is the truth. And until we acknowledge that truth and call to question what it is that we are willing to give up so that people are no longer putting their lives on the line for all of us with nothing in return, we will not be able to answer the question of how it is that we will create a more just and fair system for the Amazon workers, for the farm workers, for any of the workers in the food justice movement. And that is just the truth. And it isn't a truth that we like to acknowledge, but it is one that we must acknowledge if we're truly committed to doing better and doing right by these folks. We need to figure out how it is that we support worker-led movements that aren't unionized, because that is certainly the history and the story of farm workers in our country who are not able to unionize. Like Navina said, many of us have been purposefully left out and unable to organize, and that was not by chance. And we know that. And so to the extent that that continues to be the reality and we are still pushing to change that, we have to figure out how we will support the workers who are organizing without the benefit of that particular structure and the protections allowed under existing federal law. And then the last thing I would say on this is that, we just have to figure out how we as consumers are going to help be the push behind some of these major campaigns, because many of the organizers across the country who are doing the work in the food justice movement, our work has been underfunded. our work has not been invested in over time. Many of the organizations are volunteer-led, and there is a point in time in which we can no longer expect people to carry the weight of our movements on our backs for free. And so there is going to be a time in which we need consumers to actually put up what is required to make these movements strong.
Oh gosh. Woo! Navina, I just want to sit with that for a second. I just, Monica, you just said so much. But ultimately, what this comes down to is valuing Black and brown lives. And I don't care if that's the lives in the field. I don't care if those are the lives that are front of house or back of house in restaurants. I don't care if those are the lives that are in meat packing meat packing plants, processing our meat. Like, the valuing of Black and brown lives, which takes me to the next point that I want to get to, which is a continued story that we keep seeing over and over and over and over and over in our media, and that is the state-sanctioned violence, the over-policing, and the killing of Black men and women in our community. And I would like to say that what that is a reflection of is the failure to see value in Black lives. And so, but what we see is this state-sanctioned assaults on Black lives via food. We see it via land extraction and disposition and gentrification. Might I add that, if I can go back to Amazon for a second, that, for many of us, Monica, you talk about our work is underfunded. Sometimes we are just, we make plans, I should say, not we, but I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I make plans just on a grant cycle period. I don't know how in the world philanthropy expects us to solve centuries of exploitation and to course correct a system that has been taking place over centuries in a 12-month or a 24-month grant cycle. I say that to say Amazon thinks about transformation in 25, 50, 75 years out. And so, when I think about the fact that there was so much hoopla and ballyhoo in the city of Detroit when Detroit got its first Whole Foods, and how that was a sign and a symbol of revitalization in the city of Detroit. And the city of Detroit is coming back, when in essence, it was a long-term play by Amazon, so that Amazon was already preparing to buy Whole Foods so they can use Whole Foods as literally a distribution center to get food into low-income communities, because the next play for Amazon is the use of EBT and SNAP benefits, right? So they are going to, you talk about a behemoth, Navina, they are going to be a huge player in our food system. And we need to be keeping our eyes on that. So whether it's the disposition of our land and policing, what history teaches us, particularly as it relates to the police, is the police serve as a representative of the state that's part of a system to protect property, not us. So the question is that until we acknowledge the fact that policing and power and protection, and we begin to question who actually is the police protecting? Are they really serving and protecting the people? Are they protecting property? Because if my history tells me, and again, this is the thread that I want to draw from mommy and daddy leaving the rural South in the 60s, fleeing state-sanctioned violence and Jim Crow in Alabama, thinking they would come to Detroit, which is quote unquote the promised land, much like 6 million, 7 million African Americans did through the Great Migration. And what James Baldwin tells us before he died, we still are being governed by the slave code. Ain't really nothing changed. And so the question I ask, and I'm going to ask both of you all, if I ask you to finish this sentence, and I start off by saying, we demand, how would both of you all finish that sentence? What do we want? What are we organizing for? What are we fighting for? Except for the ability to live and breathe and for them to stop killing us. But in the context of transforming the food system or keeping migrant workers safe, what do we demand? And either one of you can jump in on that one.
Sure, I'm happy to go. I mean, we demand liberation in all of its forms, right? I mean, a lot of times people talk about my work and they say that I fight for equality, and I actually take issue with that because I think equality speaks to a certain set of laws that have been passed in our country, some of which are not equitable at all. You know, the law in our country is not always just, and we have to acknowledge that, and that has shown itself over and over again. And so we're not fighting only for equality, we're fighting for liberation, we're fighting for the ability to be seen and treated as humans, we're fighting for the ability to live with dignity. And, you know, I think, Devita, your point around institutions and systems, failure to see Black people in our country as having value, I think that is certainly the case, and we've seen that over and over again in history. And I would also say that there is a real problem in that people not only are not seeing Black people and brown people as people who have no value, but they don't believe that there will be a consequence when they do anything to harm us. And we have seen when people have been taken to trial or when charges have been brought and then dropped, we are reminded over and over again about that truth. And so I think we have to challenge that too. And we have to continue to call for the accountability of people who are disregarding us and who are harming us and who are keeping us from not only the ability to reach true liberation, but simply the ability to live.
That's right.
Yeah, literally all of that. And that, you know, just another example of how little we value the lives of Black and brown folks in this country is that as another migration is happening north right now, like kids are in cages, right? Like why is that okay? And why has that been okay for as long as it has been, right? Why has it been okay to kidnap and enslave folks, right? And work them to the death and then just replace Black bodies with other Black bodies, right? Why is that what's happening right now with farm workers and the new like Workforce Modernization Act that says you have to stay in this job, you have to be exploited and working this land in order to be able to be here. Like why are we okay with that, right? Mm-hmm. So when we say that we're fighting for our collective liberation, we're fighting for our liberation from the commodification of life, right? The privatization of life, the speculation on life, and that includes the lives of Black and brown bodies, and it includes also our air and our water and our land, right? It's sacred. Life is sacred. And instead of being able to be on this land and be in right relationship with this land and be in right relationship with each other, we're choosing instead that we are going to keep making profit off of that, right? And that it's okay to keep making profit off of that. And yes, the systems, the structures, the police force, all of it is designed to protect white folks' access to that land and that property that was stolen from others, right?
Yeah.
So,
can I say,
go ahead, Monica.
Can I say one more thing?
No, go ahead.
I was thinking about what you were saying about Detroit and how Detroit was brought back. And, you know, one of the ways that Detroit was brought back was because of philanthropy. And when I think about accountability and I think about, you know, how do we define the shackles that bind us? We have to put philanthropy in that box too, because it remains a big question in my mind, how it is that so few resources are available to our communities and have been available and invested in our communities over time. But whenever a major crisis happens, all of a sudden, millions of dollars have been found. Absolutely. And it shouldn't happen that way, because if our organizations and movements had been invested in properly over time to actually address the problems that afflict our communities, we wouldn't constantly be the most vulnerable when crisis strikes. And so when we think about accountability, it has to extend to philanthropy and to people who are working for good as well. It can't only be certain systems or certain categories of people or institutions that we are saying need to be held to a higher level.
Absolutely. And I know we are encroaching upon the 1 o'clock hour, so I want to be sensitive of time, but we did start a little late. So I just want to say that if folks can just hang out with us for about 5 minutes or so, if it's okay, if we go a little bit over, I would so greatly appreciate that, because there are two things that I really want to ask Mónica and Navina. One is, how can folks support their work? That was a question that has come up in the chat and also Q&A, but I really want to, just for a second, because I cannot let this go, because this is so powerful what both of you all just said, is I don't want to let this go in terms of accountability, not only for philanthropy, but also our government. And that gets me to the first question that was asked in the Q&A by Gina Anderson. And Gina says, we all benefit from cheap food prices, cheaper than they were in the early 1990s. And the question Gina asks is, how can we plan for what paying the real price of food does to us, our households, and our wallets? Key question. Gina says, how can we plan for the real price of food? And I just want to say two things to Gina really quickly, and I want Navina and Mónica to jump in. And number one is you're absolutely right, Gina. And Mónica, you're absolutely right as well. And that is that when our global industrialized supply chain failed us during the pandemic, and you couldn't get the food off the farms into the processing plants, from the processing plants to the drivers to drive them to their destination, it was Black and brown, urban and rural farmers, particularly in my city, in the city of Detroit, where we have over 1,900 farms and gardens. This is what a local community-based food ecosystem looks like. This is how you future-proof your community. We had 1,900 farms and gardens that we have been cultivating for decades. We passed out 60,000 seeds. We grew 260,000 transplants, 30,000 people involved in farming in the city of Detroit. We grew 485,000 tons of produce, and we fed ourselves. This is the kind of investment, Mónica, I'm talking about. This is how you future-proof, Gina, and you get ready. You don't let capital market dictate the price of food. We grow our own food. And I was just wondering if Navina or Mónica, you all had any comments on top of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Devita. That's what I mean when I say that there is so much genius and brilliance and wisdom in Black and brown communities and solutions that folks are creating on the ground, right? We know that this consolidated food system has never worked for us, and folks are organizing to do what is needed to take care of their own communities. And we saw that, when pandemic hit, we saw that folks who have the closest relationships to each other are the ones who can actually create those crisis-proof food systems, but folks don't necessarily have everything they need, right? They don't have access to land. They don't have access to the refrigerated truck. They don't have just the basic resources, right? So why are we not investing in those communities and those community leaders to be able to feed their own communities and take care of themselves? HEAL, also, just to some of the points that Mónica was making earlier, we organized with a number of other BIPOC leaders in food and farming to write an open letter to philanthropy last summer. That went really naming that, because we're seeing that across the board, across our members in communities, that people are doing exactly that. I can post the link to that too, but I think that there's so much more digging into where investment goes that we can collectively do.
Mónica, your last thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would also say that, the Department of Agriculture plays a big role here. And what we saw happen during COVID is that all of a sudden grants became available for farmers. Resources started to be released into community because there was a challenge in getting some of the crops that had been imported prior to the pandemic. And so all of a sudden there was a demand for more food to be grown in our country, and we didn't have what we needed to make sure that could happen. And so the USDA released resources to farmers to be able to grow the food, which then meant farm workers had more work, which then meant there was more of an opportunity to get locally grown produce into stores and communities. So it is all a very much related system. And I think that the more that we can work together to push on all sides, the better it is for everyone. And certainly it's better for our health as well.
I absolutely agree, Monica. And I said you were gonna have the last comment, which you did, but you talked about the role of government when you talked about the USDA. But I cannot underscore the fact that, if folks don't have this book, if you're really interested in, I'm digging into it now, and it's called Reinventing Our Food Banks. Food banks are a huge corporate kind of entity right now within itself. But the fact of the matter is, the question is then, who is responsible for at least creating a safety net for those individuals who are food insecure? And at one point in our country, prior to Ronald Reagan, and I'm going to go ahead and name the 1980s, the government invested in programs like SNAP and WIC and after school programs. The Black Panther Party gave them the blueprint for doing after school feeding programs, or the breakfast program. And the government invested in that. And these programs worked, and they were feeding our families and empowering people up until the 80s, when the government decided that they weren't going to be in the business of feeding people. They were going to change it to a charitable model and pass it off to food banks and food pantries to feed individuals. So we have to hold our government responsible, ensuring that they are too creating a social safety net for those individuals who do suffer from and fall into a situation where they are food insecure. So I said I was going to keep it to a little bit more than 5 minutes over. Navina, Monica, thank you. Shout out to your organizations. How can folks support? I know I've been seeing things being put in the chat. Navina, I know that you've put the letter that you all wrote. Any other ways folks can support HEAL? Monica, any ways folks can support you?
I think Lily dropped our websites into the chat for attendees too. That's the best way to find out more and figure out ways to support, stay in touch.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Same, and I would also encourage you to follow our social media handles, because there's new information popping up there all of the time.
Yeah, you both, HEAL and Migrant Justice for Women, have really active social media accounts. So please do find them on social media. Lily or Andy, you guys want to turn your cameras back on, your videos back on, so we can thank everyone. Any parting words, goodbyes before? Lily, you want to talk about what's in store next week? Oh, she might have had to jump off, Andy.
Yeah, so thanks, Devita. Lily's computer crashed, so she was kind of bumped off. But thank you guys so much for being here with us today and for taking the time to be here. That was amazing. We just wanted to briefly note that we'll be having our third session of the Food Literacy for All series. It's going to be happening. We just confirmed it for May 13th. It's going to be at the same time at noon, and we're going to be focusing in that session more on policy and understanding what policy can do to be transforming our food systems at that time. So please join us for that talk. And yeah, thank you for being here today. I don't know if you have any closing comments, Devita or Ayana, but it looks like Lily's jumping back on right at the end here, but
I think Lily is getting back on. I'll just say that again, thank you so much, Monica and Navina. I want to connect both of you afterwards. That was my plan, and I'm so excited about our next talk, which is on May 13th, and we're going to have someone who I love. I think she's beloved in our community, Mrs. Shirley Sherrod, and then Samina Raja, and so y'all make sure that you join us next month as well. Thank y'all so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.